The village of St. Mary Mead was currently enjoying the peak of the social season, the Midsummer Rose exhibition. It was an event characterized by polite nods, sharp-elbowed competition, and a scent so cloyingly sweet it seemed to mask the very possibility of malice. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a sensible lilac silk dress with a lace fichu, sat on a folding chair near the refreshment marquee. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail, elderly lady engrossed in her knitting pal. She was observing the villagers with the clinical precision of a biologist studying a petri dish. She knew that beneath the festive bunting and the prize-winning blooms, the soil of St. Mary Mead was often fertilized with long-standing grudges and suppressed resentments. The center of attention was Sir George Arbuthnot, a man whose wealth was as vast as his arrogance. He had recently returned from a decade in the Levant, bringing with him a collection of rare damask roses and a young, strikingly beautiful wife named Elena. Sir George moved through the crowd like a conqueror, his booming voice drowning out the gentle strains of the local brass band. He stopped before the display of Miss Lavinia Glynn, a woman whose family had lived in the village for generations and who had won the Best in Show title for 12 consecutive years. "A valiant effort, Lavinia," Sir George remarked, his tone dripping with condescension. "But your English shrub roses lack the, shall we say, fire. My Sultan's blood specimens possess a vitality that makes these local varieties look quite anemic, don't you think?" Miss Glynn's face turned a shade of white that rivaled her own snow maiden roses. She clutched her gardening shears so tightly her knuckles turned brittle. Nearby, Arthur Melford, the local chemist and a man of noted nervous disposition, dropped his teacup. The clatter of china on the grass felt disproportionately loud. Elena Arbuthnot, standing a few paces behind her husband, looked not at the flowers but at the horizon, her expression one of profound, weary boredom, perhaps. As Miss Marple noted, the look of someone waiting for a specific signal. "It is a very strange thing the way people treat flowers," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm. "They imagine that because they can prune a bush, they can control the nature of the plant itself. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Willoughby at the bank. He was so meticulous about his hedges, yet he never noticed the dry rot in his own rafters until the roof fell in. People are so often distracted by the surface of things." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the moment for the grand unveiling arrived. Sir George was to present his Sultan's blood roses in a special glass pavilion at the far end of the garden. The crowd gathered, their whispers hushed in anticipation of the diplomat's triumph. Sir George stepped onto the small wooden dais, a silver key in his hand. He offered the audience a theatrical bow, his eyes lingering for a moment on Miss Glynn with a look of unmistakable triumph. "Behold," he announced, turning the key in the pavilion's lock, "the pride of the East, brought to the heart of the English countryside." He stepped inside the glass structure to pull back the velvet curtain. There was a sudden muffled gasp from within, followed by a wet choking sound that chilled the midsummer air. For a heartbeat, the crowd remained frozen. Then Sir George stumbled back through the glass door, his hands clutching his throat. A dark, visceral crimson far deeper and more terrifying than the hue of any rose-bagon to bloom across the front of his pristine white linen suit. He took one stumbling step toward his wife, his mouth opening as if to speak a name, but no sound emerged. He collapsed forward into a bed of Miss Glynn's white roses, his life's blood staining the petals. Elena Arbuthnot's piercing scream shattered the silence that followed. In the ensuing chaos, as the village doctor rushed forward and the local constable struggled to keep the panicked crowd at bay, Miss Marple remained remarkably still. Her pale blue eyes were fixed not on the body of the fallen knight, but on the ground near the pavilion's entrance. There, half hidden by a discarded program, lay a small, ivory-handled razor, its blade glinting with a lethal silver light in the fading sun. "The poor man," Miss Marple whispered, her fingers tracing the wool in her bag. "He was so focused on the thorns of his roses that he never saw the edge of the steel. It is very like the tragedy of the old clockmaker's daughter Evrione was so busy watching the hands of the clock that no one noticed who was winding the spring. She watched as Arthur Melford turned away, his face a ghostly shade of grey. As Miss Glynn stood motionless, her gardening shears still gripped in her hand, the blade stained with nothing more than the green sap of her snow maidens. The Midsummer Rose exhibition had come to a violent end, and the peace of St. Mary Mead was gone, replaced by a mystery that was already beginning to weave its thorns through the hearts of everyone present. The morning following the tragedy at the Midsummer Rose exhibition found St. Mary Mead Day in a state of high-strung animation that no ordinary Sunday could ever hope to inspire. The village was not merely shocked, it was revitalized by a scandal of such operatic proportions. At the local post office, which served as the central exchange for all intelligence both verified and imagined, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the electric thrill of a high-society murder. Mrs. Pringle, standing near the display of commemorative stamps, was already holding court with a vigor that suggested she had personally witnessed the crime from 3 different angles. She insisted that the foreign element brought back by Sir George from the Levant was at the heart of the matter, hinting darkly at secret societies and ancient blood feuds that had finally tracked the diplomat to his English doorstep. Miss Marple stood quietly by the rack of greeting cards, her pale blue eyes watching the shifting patterns of the crowd with the patient detachment of a weaver at a loom. She noted how the shock of the murder was rapidly being replaced by a predatory curiosity regarding the young widow, Elena Arbuthnot. The village, it seemed, had already reached a collective verdict on the lady's character. To the matrons of St. Mary Mead, Elena's striking beauty and her weary, distant manner during the festival were clear indicators of a heart as cold as marble. They whispered about a clandestine lover hidden in the woods, or perhaps a secret inheritance that could only be accessed over Sir George's dead body. It is a very curious thing the way people see what they expect to see, Miss Marple remarked to the vicar's wife, who was clutching a bundle of parish circulars with trembling hands. When old Mr. Garnet's prize pig went missing last spring, half the village swore they had seen a gypsy caravan on the lane, when in fact the poor creature had merely wandered into the vicarage cellar through an open door. We seek the exotic when the truth is usually as local as the mud on our boots. Sir George was a man who lived a very public life of arrogance, and in my experience, that is a much more dangerous thing than any foreign secret. He trod on many toes, and eventually someone was bound to stop him from dancing. Inside the Blue Duck tea room, the conversation was more focused. Arthur Melford, the chemist, sat in a corner booth, his hands shaking so violently that his spoon rattled against his saucer like a telegraph key. He was surrounded by the village's most persistent gossips, who were eager to know if the ivory-handled razor found at the scene had come from his own shop. Arthur's defense was a stuttered, incoherent mess of denials, but the damage was done. The village had already begun to weave a narrative where the nervous chemist had been coerced into providing the weapon by a more dominant, sinister figure. Miss Marple, sitting at a nearby table with her knitting bag, watched Arthur with a mixture of pity and calculation. She knew Arthur Melford. He was a man who would apologize to a lamppost if he bumped into it. The idea of him wielding a razor was as improbable as the local curate leading a pirate raid. However, she also noticed how Miss Lavinia Glynn was sitting at the far end of the room, her spine as rigid as a garden stake. Lavinia was not talking, she was listening, her eyes darting from face to face, as if she were weeding a particularly difficult patch of soil. The snow maiden roses she had championed were now forever associated with the blood of a knight, and the social humiliation Sir George had heaped upon her was a motive that the village was only too happy to discuss in hushed tones. People assume that murder is a grand, sweeping gesture, Miss Marple mused to herself, her needles resuming their soft click-clack. But it is often a very small, very private matter that has simply grown out of hand, like the time the churchwarden's daughter cut all the buttons off her sister's wedding dress. It wasn't about the dress, it was about a stolen ribbon from 10 years before. Sir George's death has the look of a very grand tragedy, but I suspect the roots are much shallower and much more twisted than Mrs. Pringle's foreign spies. The village reacts with fantasy because they are afraid of the reality that someone they know, someone they invite to tea, could hold a razor with such steady hands. As the afternoon shadows began to stretch across the green, the police car carrying Inspector Slack arrived at the Arbuthnot estate. The village watched from behind their lace curtains, their theories becoming more elaborate with every passing hour. The reaction was a mirror of the crime itself, cluttered with irrelevancies and fueled by a desperate need for the world to make sense. But beneath the talk of Levant's secrets and hidden lovers, Miss Marple was thinking about the gardening shears and the way the silver key had turned in the lock. The pattern was forming, not in the loud proclamations of the post office, but in the silence of those who were currently mourning a victory they hadn't expected to win. The following afternoon, the air around the glass pavilion at the Arbuthnot estate had lost the sweetness of the rose exhibition, replaced by the sterile, lingering scent of police disinfectant and the heavy, damp smell of turned earth. Inspector Slack had spent the better part of the morning barking orders at his constables, demanding they search every inch of the surrounding shrubbery for a discarded glove or a bloody footprint. He was a man who believed that if one shouted at a crime scene long enough, the evidence would eventually surrender out of sheer exhaustion. Miss Marple, however, arrived with no such fanfare. She carried a small basket of preserves for the grieving widow, a social camouflage that allowed her to drift past the yellow police tape with the quiet persistence of a summer breeze. As Slack engaged the local sergeant in a heated debate regarding the logistics of the locked pavilion door, Miss Marple moved toward the glass structure itself. She did not look at the chalk outline on the floorboards, nor did she linger on the silver key still protruding from the lock. Instead, she stood where Sir George had stood and looked out through the glass at the meticulously planned rows of Sultan's blood roses. The bushes were arranged in a star pattern, their deep crimson heads nodding in the light wind. To the untrained eye, they were a triumph of horticulture, but to Miss Marple, who had spent decades measuring the growth of her own hollyhocks, something was fundamentally amiss with the geography of the display. It is a very curious thing, the way a garden changes when the master is away, she murmured to herself, her knitting needles clicking a soft, rhythmic accompaniment to her thoughts. I remember young Peter West at the rectory. He was so anxious to prove he had been working while the vicar was in London that he transplanted an entire row of peonies to hide where Head dug a hole for his lost marbles. He didn't realize that flowers have their own memory. If you move them, they never sit at the same angle to the sun. These roses here, near the entrance, have a very peculiar lean to them, as if they were adjusted by someone whose hands were much larger than a gardener's. She knelt with surprising agility for a woman of her years, her fingers brushing the soil at the base of a particularly vibrant bush. The earth was loose, not with the natural aeration of a worm, but with the frantic packing of a human hand. More strikingly, she noticed a height discrepancy. The Sultan's blood roses near the back were nearly 6 inches taller than those near the door, creating a subtle slope that Sir George, in his vanity, would surely have corrected. It reminded her of the time the local draper tried to hide a flaw in a roll of silk by folding it in a way that defied the natural grain. Someone had been working in this pavilion long after the exhibition had been set up, and they hadn't been interested in the health of the plants. "You there, Miss Marple?" Inspector Slack's voice cut through the stillness like a blunt saw. I told the constable no visitors. This is a secure area. We've found the razor. We've got the motive. Lavinia Glynn's shears were practically vibrating with resentment, and now we just need the physical evidence to tie it together. I don't need elderly ladies trampling the flower beds. "I am so sorry, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice a gentle, apologetic twitter. "I was merely admiring Sultan's blood. It is such a shame they are so uneven. Sir George was such a perfectionist, I can't imagine he would have allowed the bushes near the door to be so much shorter than the rest. It almost looks like the ground has sunk, doesn't it? Like the time the old well at the baker's house gave way, and the entire vegetable patch moved 3 inches to the left in a single night. A very unsettling feeling for a gardener, I should think." Slack snorted, dismissive of what he considered a senile preoccupation with landscaping. "Ground sinking? It's a murder, not a geological survey. We're looking for a killer who hid in the shadows, not someone who played with the dirt. Now, if you please, Mrs. Arbuthnot is waiting in the morning room. I have a statement to make that actually involves human beings." Miss Marple watched him stomp away, her blue eyes sharp and thoughtful. She knew that Slack was looking for a person, but she was looking at a pattern. The uneven roses and the packed soil told a story that had nothing to do with a sudden impulse of rage. It suggested a crime of preparation, one that required the perpetrator to spend time in the pavilion, hidden by the very beauty Sir George had so loudly championed. The early investigation was focused on the razor and the shears, the visible instruments of death, but Miss Marple was thinking about the height of the bushes and the silver key. In St. Mary Mead, the most dangerous things were often the ones buried just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to trip over a secret they had mistaken for a rose. By the following morning, the weight of the law had descended fully upon Arthur Melford. Inspector Slack had spent 3 hours in the back of the chemist's shop, surrounded by jars of bismuth and essence of peppermint, convinced that he had found the epicenter of the conspiracy. The ivory-handled razor was a match for a set Arthur had sold 6 months prior, and the poor man's inability to produce a ledger for that specific week was, to Slack, as good as a confession. The inspector was currently operating on the theory that a person of stronger will had coerced Arthur, and his eyes were firmly fixed on the Arbuthnot estate, specifically on the young widow whose foreign origins remained a source of constant, low-level irritation to the local authorities. Miss Marple sat in the morning room of the manor house, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, persistent pace that seemed to unnerve Elena Arbuthnot. The widow was draped in a heavy veil of black crepe, a garment so dense it seemed to absorb the light from the garden windows. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her silence a sharp contrast to the frantic activity of the police outside. Miss Marple, however, was not looking at Elena's face. Her gaze was fixed on the very edge of the mourning veil, where a small, stiff discoloration marred the fine fabric. It was not a splash of tea or a smudge of dust. It was a dark, greenish-brown stain that had the unmistakable crystalline texture of dried sap and crushed chlorophyll. "It is a very heavy veil, my dear," Miss Marple remarked, her voice a gentle murmur that barely disturbed the stillness. "Reminds me so much of poor Mrs. Fortescue after the tragedy at the lodge. She insisted on the heaviest mourning, yet she was always tripping over the hem because she refused to lift it. It is a prideful thing, mourning, yet it often hides the most practical difficulties, like working in a garden, for instance. One must be so careful not to let the delicate fabric catch on the thorns or drag in the damp soil." Elena's head turned slowly, the dark mesh of the veil obscuring her expression. "I have not been in the garden since the murder, Miss Marple. The police have forbidden it. I sit here, and I wait for the world to stop turning, though it seems determined to continue its gossip." Of course, Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes bright behind her spectacles. "But then, roses are such demanding creatures. Even a sultan's blood requires attention before the show begins. I noticed that the bushes near the pavilion door had been trimmed very recently, not by a gardener's hand, I think, but by someone who was in a very great hurry to see through the glass. It is a strange thing to prune a rose from the bottom rather than the top. It reminds me of the time the local postmaster tried to look through the vicar's window by cutting a hole in the ivy. He thought no one would notice, but the leaves always turn a very specific shade of brown when they are bruised by steel." She paused to adjust a stitch, her needles never missing a beat. "Arthur Melford is a very nervous man, Elena. He is the sort of man who would give you his last shilling if you asked for it with enough conviction. He is not a soil man. He wouldn't know a damask rose from a dandelion. To think of him lurking in a pavilion is like imagining a sheep in a lion's den. But someone was there. Someone who knew exactly how the light would hit the glass, and someone who didn't mind getting a bit of green sap on their very expensive mourning clothes." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of Inspector Slack shouting at a constable near the stables. Elena did not move, but her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair until the wood creaked. Miss Marple watched the stain on the veil. It was a small, seemingly unimportant detail, yet it told a story of a woman who had been standing very close to the roses long before the grand unveiling. The first suspects were always those with the weapon or the obvious grudge, but Miss Marple was thinking about the height of the bushes and the mechanical necessity of a clear line of sight. Arthur Melford might have sold the razor, but he lacked the cold, botanical patience required to wait for a man to turn a key. As she watched the widow, Miss Marple realized that the veil was not just a symbol of grief, it was a curtain designed to hide a very specific kind of preparation. The pattern was shifting from the frantic guilt of the chemist to the calculated stillness of the manor house. and the green stain on the black crepe was the first real thread of the truth. The afternoon sun had begun to beat down with a relentless, heavy heat that made the very air in the Arbuthnot Gardens feel thick and suffocating. Miss Marple, however, appeared entirely unaffected by the temperature as she made her way toward the estate's sprawling compost heaps, located far from the prying eyes of the police and the main pavilion. She carried a small, empty wicker basket, the perfect excuse for a lady of her years to be foraging for a bit of leaf mould or perhaps a few discarded cuttings for her own modest garden. To the constable guarding the perimeter of the rose beds, she was merely a harmless eccentric, a fragment of village life that required no scrutiny. But Miss Marple was not looking for mulch. She was looking for the debris of a very specific kind of architectural deception. She found it near the base of the secondary heap, partially obscured by a pile of wilted grass clippings and the discarded stems of common marigolds. It was a fragment of a sturdy, dark green wooden lattice, but it was not the decorative kind found on a typical trellis. It was a structural piece, designed to hold a significant weight, and it bore the unmistakable indentations of heavy-duty metal clamps. Beside it lay a discarded piece of thick, industrial-grade foam, stained with the same dark, irony-rich soil that Miss Marple had noticed at the base of the Sultan's blood roses earlier that morning. She retrieved a small magnifying glass from her knitting bag and leaned in close, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she studied the texture of the foam. "How very ingenious," she murmured to herself, her needles for once remaining silent in her bag. "It reminds me so much of the time the local theatrical society tried to build a balcony for Romeo and Juliet out of old vegetable crates and a bit of borrowed upholstery. It looked perfectly solid from the audience's perspective, but the poor young man playing Romeo nearly met his end because the structure wasn't designed for a person of his particular girth. This wasn't meant to hold a person, though. It was meant to hold a landscape, fake floor for fake garden. One does not simply plant roses in a glass pavilion overnight unless one brings the ground with them. She realized then why the roses near the door were shorter than those at the back. It was not a matter of uneven growth or poor pruning, it was a matter of elevation. The roses at the rear were sitting on the actual floor of the pavilion, but the bushes near the entrance had been positioned on a raised, artificial platform. This platform had been cleverly concealed with loose soil and moss to give the appearance of a continuous, natural bed. But why go to such immense lengths to raise a few rose bushes by 6 inches? The answer, as Miss Marple knew from her years of watching the village choir rehearsals, was always a matter of sightlines. If a man of Sir George's height were to stand on the dais and turn a key, the raised platform would have obscured everything beneath his waist from the view of the crowd outside. She stood up, her back creaking slightly as she straightened, and looked back toward the glass pavilion. The hidden clue was not a weapon or a confession, but a piece of discarded foam and a fragment of lattice. It told a story of a crime that had been constructed with the precision of a stage set. The murderer had not been hiding in the shadows of the garden, they had been hiding beneath the very roses Sir George was so proud to display. The raised platform had created a hollow space, a crawlway large enough for a person of slight build to wait in total concealment. When Sir George turned the key and entered, he was not alone in the pavilion. Someone had reached up from beneath the Sultan's blood, their hand guided by the gaps in the lattice, to deliver the fatal stroke before retreating back into the earth. This discovery changed the entire nature of the investigation. It was no longer a question of who had the razor or who had been seen pacing the lawn. It was a question of who had the physical access and the technical knowledge to build a false floor under the nose of a man like Sir George. It required someone who understood the pavilion's construction, someone who could move heavy materials without arousing suspicion, and someone who knew exactly where Sir George would stand. Miss Marple thought of the green spot on Elena's veil once more. It wasn't just sap from a pruned branch, it was the mark of someone who had spent hours cramped beneath a bed of roses, waiting for the sound of a silver key in a lock. The pattern was now one of mechanical genius and terrifying patience, and as she walked slowly back toward the house, Miss Marple knew that the chemist's razor was merely the finishing touch on a much larger, much more subterranean trap. The following afternoon, the air in the estate's potting shed was heavy with the scent of dried peat, and the metallic tang of old garden tools. Miss Marple sat on a low wooden stool, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm that seemed to pace the gathering tension. Across from her, Lavinia Glynn was meticulously cleaning a set of heavy-duty shears, her movements sharp and deliberate. The village had been whispering for days about Lavinia's public humiliation at the hands of Sir George, but Miss Marple was more interested in the practicalities of the Arbuthnot estate's recent renovations. She knew that Lavinia had not only been the village's premier gardener, but had also acted as a consultant for the pavilion's construction, before Sir George had abruptly terminated her services in favour of a firm from London. "It is a very painful thing, Lavinia, to see one's work taken over by strangers," Miss Marple began, her voice a soft, sympathetic murmur, "especially when those strangers don't understand the local soil. I remember poor Mr. Abernathy, who hired a group of city contractors to build his conservatory. They were very efficient, of course, but they didn't realize the ground was prone to shifting. He had to spend months correcting their mistakes in secret, just to keep the glass from cracking. It must have been very similar here. Sir George was a man who wanted results, but he never cared for the process. I imagine you found yourself back in that pavilion more than once, correcting the shoddy workmanship of those London men." Lavinia did not look up, but her hands paused for a split second. Sir George was a fool who thought money could replace expertise, Jane. Those men built a stage, not a garden. They left the drainage in a state of ruin. If I hadn't gone in at night to shore up the foundations, the entire display would have sunk into the mud before the first guest arrived. I didn't do it for him, I did it for the roses. No true gardener can stand to see a sultan's blood mistreated by amateurs. "And that is why you knew about the hollow space beneath the floor," Miss Marple said gently, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "You weren't just fixing the drainage. You were the one who suggested the raised platform to the contractors, ostensibly to improve the visual impact for the judges. But in reality, you created a space where a person could move unseen. You knew Sir George's routines, and you knew exactly how the key worked. It is a very dangerous thing to have a man of his temper in a small village, especially when he has secrets that involve more than just roses. I happened to find a very old letter in the chemist's record zone that Sir George had sent to Arthur Melford years ago, threatening to ruin his business if he didn't provide certainty, delicate supplies for his travels in the Levant." Lavinia finally looked up, her expression one of cold, hard defiance. "Arthur is a weak man, Jane. He has been paying Sir George hush money for a decade over a mistake he made in a prescription back in 15. A mistake that didn't hurt anyone, but Sir George held it over him like a razor. And then there was Elena. Everyone thinks she married him for money, but she was a prisoner. He held her family's debts over her head, just as he held Arthur's reputation. He was a collector of people's fears, Jane. He didn't just grow roses, he grew misery. The gardener who left so suddenly, he didn't leave because he was lazy. He left because he found out what Sir George was doing to the housemaids and tried to stop him. Sir George had him blacklisted from every estate in the county. So you see, the secrets are never just about one person, Miss Marple mused, her needles resuming their work. It was a community of resentment. You provided the architecture, Arthur provided the weapon, and Elena provided the opportunity. But only one person could be under that floor, Lavinia. Only one person had the strength to hold that platform steady and the precision to strike when the light hit the glass. Elena's mourning veil had the sap of a rose on it, but your gardening apron has the mark of the industrial foam I found in the compost heap. It is a very specific kind of dust, the sort that only accumulates when one is working in a confined space beneath a wooden lattice. The silence that followed was absolute, the heavy weight of a collective truth finally pressing down upon the small shed. The snow maiden roses Lavinia had loved were a symbol of her purity in the village's eyes, but she had used her knowledge of the earth to facilitate a very dark harvest. She hadn't acted alone in her hatred, but she had been the one to execute the plan. The confrontation revealed a web of blackmail and abuse that made Sir George's death look less like a murder and more like a surgical removal. As Miss Marple stood to leave, she noticed a small, silver key hanging from a hook near the door, not the one for the pavilion, but the one for the chemist's private cabinet. The pattern was complete, but the most difficult part was yet to come. The village wanted a monster, but the truth was a group of ordinary people who had simply decided that the thorns had become too sharp to bear. The following morning, a startling development arrived in the form of a small, nondescript man named Mr. Henderson, a site surveyor from the London construction firm Sir George had so abruptly dismissed. He had travelled down to St. Mary Mead not to offer condolences but to settle a professional grievance regarding an unpaid invoice. In his briefcase, he carried a series of progress photographs taken during the final stages of the pavilion's assembly images, meant to document the structural integrity of the glass before the local interference had supposedly ruined the drainage. When Inspector Slack laid eyes on the penultimate photograph in the series, his entire theory regarding the chemist's lone involvement vanished like mist over the village pond. The photograph, taken through the open roof of the pavilion before the glass panes were set, clearly showed the interior of the rose beds, but they were not beds at all. They were a series of hollow, reinforced chambers, and crouching within one of them was a figure whose face was partially obscured, yet whose presence changed the entire geography of the crime. This revelation introduced a second, much cooler layer to the deception. The figure in the photograph was not the slight, ethereal Elena, nor was it the rigid Miss Glynn. It was a man of significant build, wearing the distinctively patterned waistcoat of Sir George's own butler, Thompson. This twist suggested that the community of resentment Miss Marple had sensed was even more organized than she had initially theorized. If the butler had been inside the floor, then the murder was not a desperate act of revenge by a group of victims. It was a professional execution facilitated by the very man who held the keys to the manor house. The existence of the hollow chambers proved that the pavilion had been designed as a trap from its very inception, a mechanical slaughterhouse disguised as a sanctuary for rare blooms. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden, her knitting needles clicking with a sharp, unrelenting precision. She looked at the copy of the photograph Slack had grudgingly shown her. "It is a very complex way to be simple, Raymond," she murmured to her nephew, who was visiting for the weekend. "People assume that a butler is a fixture of the house, like a sideboard or a grandfather clock. They forget that a butler sees everything and says nothing until the day he decides that his silence has a price. It reminds me so much of old Mr. Babington's valet, who spent 20 years polishing his master's shoes while secretly planning to emigrate to Australia on the proceeds of the master's stamp collection. He didn't hate Mr. Babington, he simply found him inconvenient to his future plans. The presence of the butler in the foundations of the pavilion provided the physical strength required to manage the heavy lattice and the foam, but it also introduced a new motive. Thompson had been with Sir George in the Levant, a witness to the diplomat's darkest dealings. If Sir George had intended to replace Thompson with a newer, younger staff upon his return to Englanders, the village gossip suggested butler would have faced a future of poverty and silence. The murder was no longer just about Elena's freedom or Lavinia's pride, it was about the preservation of a secret that Thompson carried like a weapon. The another twist was that the razor found at the scene, while sold by Arthur Melford, had not been stolen or coerced. Thompson had purchased it quite openly months ago, ostensibly for Sir George's own grooming kit. This new evidence reinforced the idea that the killer's deception had been a collaborative effort, a theatre of death where each participant played a vital role. The chemist provided the steel, the gardener provided the stage, and the butler provided the hand that moved in the dark. But as Inspector Slack rushed to the manor house to arrest Thompson, Miss Marple remained focused on the one detail that still didn't fit the mechanical perfection of the crime. She thought about the silver key in the lock and the way Sir George had collapsed forward. If Thompson had been under the floor, he would have had to strike upward. Yet the wound on Sir George's throat had been a horizontal slash, delivered with the precision of a man standing directly in front of his victim. The photograph proved the butler was on the floor during construction, but it didn't prove he was there when the key turned. The pattern was shifting once again, revealing a third, even more shadow-draped layer of the truth. The butler had built the trap, but someone else had occupied it. Miss Marple realized that the photograph was not a record of the murder, but a record of the rehearsal. Thompson had been testing the mechanism, ensuring the sight lines were clear and the lattice was stable. But on the day of the exhibition, the person who crawled into that hollow space was someone Sir George would never have suspected. Somione, who knew that a butler's waistcoat is the most effective camouflage in an English household. As the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple knew that the final test would not be for the butler or the chemist, but for the person who had the most to gain from the silence that follows a well-placed razor. The following afternoon, Miss Marple orchestrated a gathering that felt more like a stage production than a formal investigation. She had requested that Elena, Lavinia, Arthur Melford, and the butler Thompson meet her at the glass pavilion, under the guise of assisting the police with a practical recreation of the floral display. The air inside the glass structure was stifling, the sun beating down on the remaining roses until they seemed to throb with a heavy, sickly fragrance. Inspector Slack stood by the door, his arms crossed and his expression one of profound skepticism, yet he had allowed the demonstration to proceed because he was at a total loss regarding the horizontal nature of the fatal wound. Miss Marple sat on her folding chair just outside the threshold, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, persistent pace that seemed to heighten the silence of the garden. It is a very difficult thing to see what is right in front of one's eyes when one is blinded by a grand performance. Miss Marple began, her gaze drifting over the assembled group. I remember a very clever young man in St. Mary Mead who used to perform card tricks at the village social. He would make a coin disappear from his right hand while everyone was watching his left, never realizing that the coin was actually being held by his assistant, who was sitting perfectly still in the front row. The assistant was the most important part of the trick, yet because she didn't move, no one ever looked at her. This pavilion is much like that card trick. We have been so focused on who was under the floor or who held the razor that we have ignored the person who was standing right there, in the light, waiting for the curtain to rise. She gestured toward the raised platform of roses, where the Sultan's blood specimens were already beginning to wither. Thompson, would you be so kind as to step into the hollow space you so carefully constructed? The inspector would like to see if a man of your stature can truly reach the height required to strike at a man's throat while he is standing on the dais. The butler hesitated, his face a mask of professional neutrality, before lowering himself into the hidden chamber beneath the lattice. As he moved, the floor creaked, a heavy mechanical sound that resonated through the glass. Miss Marple watched not Thompson but the others. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her veil casting a shadow over her heart, but Arthur Melford began to rub his palms together with a frantic, dry sound. Lavinia Glynn, however, was staring at the silver key in the lock with an intensity that was almost hungry. You see, Miss Marple continued, the horizontal wound was the problem. A man reaching up from below would strike at an angle. To deliver a level blow, the killer had to be at the same height as Sir George. But there was no one else in the pavilion when it was locked, and the crowd was watching the door. It was a physical impossibility, unless the person inside the floor wasn't Thompson at all. It reminds me of the time the local locksmith's apprentice tried to hide the fact Head lost a key by building a second door inside the first. He thought that if he controlled geography, he could control the truth. Miss Marple then did something entirely unexpected. She reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a small, heavy ball of lead weight, the kind used for measuring the depth of a pond. She tossed it onto the raised platform of roses. The structure did not merely creak, it shifted with a sudden sharp snap. A second, smaller panel hidden within the first sprang open like a trapdoor. It was positioned exactly where a person would stand if they were helping Sir George arrange the velvet curtains, a person whose presence in the pavilion would be seen by the crowd not as an intrusion, but as a necessary part of the ceremony. The final test of a secret is how it reacts to the light, Miss Marple said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register. The person in the photograph was Thompson, yes, but he was only the builder. The person who occupied that space on the day of the fair had to be someone whose disappearance from the crowd would not be noticed, and whose reappearance at Sir George's side would seem perfectly natural. Someone who knew that a horizontal strike is easiest when the victim is leaning forward to kiss his wife's hand. It wasn't the butler under that floor, and it wasn't the gardener. It was the only person who could wear a black mourning veil to hide the green sap on her clothes before the murder even took place. She turned her eyes fully upon Elena Arbuthnot. The young widow did not scream, but for the first time her hands began to tremble with a violent, rhythmic force. The psychological game had reached its conclusion. The revelation of the second trapdoor had stripped away the last layer of her protection. Miss Marple had not looked for a killer, she had looked for the stagehand, who had disguised her movements as a part of the play. Elena had not been a victim waiting for a rescue, she had been the director of the tragedy, using the resentment of the village to build a stage where she could finally cut the strings that held her captive. The stillness within the glass pavilion was absolute, save for the rhythmic, metallic click of Miss Marple's knitting needles, a sound that now carried the weight of a ticking clock. Inspector Slack stood by the dais, his mouth slightly agape as he looked from the hidden spring mechanism of the trapdoor to the pale, veiled woman standing by the roses. The transition from a theory of a bumbling chemist to the reality of a cold, mechanical execution was so swift that the air in the room seemed to have been sucked out. Miss Marple did not look at the inspector. Her eyes remained fixed on Elena Arbuthnot, who had finally pushed back the heavy crepe of her veil to reveal a face as sharp and unforgiving as the razor found in the grass. "It is a very clever thing, my dear, to use the resentment of others as a shield for one's own purpose," Miss Marple began, her voice a gentle, steady ripple. "In St. Mary Mead, we had a very similar situation with the local schoolmaster's wife. She was quite convinced that her husband was being bullied by the Board of Governors, so she encouraged all the other parents to sign a petition of protest. While everyone was busy shouting at the meeting, she was quietly moving her own belongings out of the house and into the arms of the local doctor. She used the community's genuine anger to mask her own very private departure. You did the same, Elena. You knew Lavinia Glynn hated your husband for his arrogance, and you knew Arthur Melford feared him for his secrets. You didn't have to convince them to kill him, you simply had to provide the architecture for a tragedy they were already dreaming of." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her needles never missing a beat. "The community of resentment was your greatest invention. You allowed Lavinia to suggest the raised platform, knowing that she would see it as a way to fix the drainage, while you saw it as a way to hide your own movements. You encouraged Arthur to talk about his Levant secrets, making him feel that he was part of a conspiracy, which ensured his silence when the razor went missing. But you were the only one who truly understood how the pavilion worked. Thompson built it under your direction, thinking he was helping you escape a tyrant, but you were actually building a stage where you could be both the victim and the executioner. The horizontal wound, Inspector, was only possible because Elena wasn't reaching up from the floor. She was standing on the second, higher ledge, perfectly positioned to strike as Sir George leaned in to open the velvet curtain. Elena's hands were still now, her fingers interlaced with a terrifying, calm precision. "He was a monster, Jane. He didn't just own things, he consumed them. He treated me like a rare specimen to be locked in a glass box and shown off to a village of gossips. He would never have let me go. A divorce would have been a public admission of his own failure, and Sir George did not permit himself to fail. I didn't just want him dead, I wanted him to die in the very moment of his greatest vanity. I wanted him to be killed by the very thing he loved, Mosti's Sultan's blood roses. And that is the saddest part of all." Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes filled with a profound, quiet sorrow. "You became exactly like him to defeat him. You used people's loyalty and their pain as if they were nothing more than the foam and the lattice beneath your feet. You let the green sap stain your veil before the crime because you had to spend hours practicing the mechanism, ensuring that the trapdoor would spring silently. You were so focused on the precision of the steel that you forgot that a village like St. Mary Mead is full of eyes that notice when a rose bush is an inch too short or when a lady's mourning clothes are a bit too ready. The razor was Arthur's, the floor was Lavinia's, and the silence was Thompson's, but the hand that moved with such ruthless efficiency was yours alone. Inspector Slack finally found his voice, signaling to his constables to step forward. "The mechanism is definitive, Miss Arbuthnot. The second ledge is built for someone of your specific weight and height, and we've found the second silver kythe one that opens the side hatch hidden in your sewing basket. It wasn't a community of resentment, it was a solo performance with a very large supporting cast." As the police led Elena away, the young woman did not look back. She walked with the same weary, distant grace she had displayed at the festival, a queen of roses who had finally cut herself free from the stems. Miss Marple watched her go, then slowly began to pack away her knitting, The reveal was over. The clues had all clicked into place like the gears of an old clock, and the midsummer sun was finally beginning to set on the most deadly exhibition St. Mary Mead had ever seen. The razor was gone, the roses were wilting, and the truth, as always, had proved to be the sharpest thorn of all. The following week, St. Mary Mead seemed to shrink back into its accustomed skin, much like a snail retracting after a particularly jarring encounter with a garden trowel. The great marquee of the Rose exhibition had been dismantled, leaving behind nothing but a series of pale, rectangular patches on the manor house lawn where the grass had been denied the sun. The glass pavilion, once the site of such architectural vanity and mechanical cruelty, stood silent and empty. The police had finally removed their yellow tape, but the villagers still avoided that particular corner of the estate, as if the very air around the structure remained tainted by the scent of copper and crushed petals. The Sultan's blood roses, deprived of their meticulous care, had begun to drop their heavy crimson heads, the ground beneath them littered with the debris of a triumph that had turned into a tomb. Miss Marple sat in her own garden, her knitting needles moving with a slow, meditative pace. The wool she was using was a soft, heather green, a colour that felt appropriate for the quiet melancholy of the afternoon. Beside her, Dolly Bantry was ostensibly helping with the deadheading of the geraniums, though her movements were distracted and her eyes frequently strayed toward the direction of the Arbuthnot estate. The news of Elena's arrest and the subsequent revelations about the hidden trapdoor and the complicity of the household staff had left the village in a state of exhausted bewilderment. It was as if a play they had all been enjoying had suddenly turned real, leaving the audience to realize they were standing on the stage. "It is a very sad business," Dolly murmured, wiping her garden shears with a piece of oily rag. "To think that so many people could be so unhappy in one house, and that we all just stood there admiring the flowers. I feel as though I shall never be able to look at a rose again without wondering what is buried beneath its roots." And poor Arthur Melford shuttered the chemist's shop for a month. He says he can't bear the way people look at him, as if they are waiting for him to sell them something lethal. Miss Marple paused, her needles stilled for a brief moment as she looked at a hovering bumblebee. "Human nature is very much like a garden, Dolly. We spend so much time cultivating the blooms we want the world to see, but we often forget that the weeds are growing in the dark places beneath. Elena Arbuthnot was a woman who had been pruned until there was nothing left of her but a single, sharp thorn. It reminds me so much of poor Mrs. Randall's niece. She was so controlled by her mother that she eventually learned to communicate entirely in the language of accidents. A broken vase here, a lost key there, all of them small acts of rebellion, until the day she simply walked out of the house and never returned. Elena just took it to a much more devastating conclusion. She didn't want to walk away, she wanted to erase the person who had made her a prisoner. The village gossip had already begun to shift, as it always did, away from the tragedy and toward the practicalities of the aftermath. There was talk of the manor house being sold to a developers syndicate, and rumours that Lavinia Glynn was planning to move to the south of France to start a lavender farm. Thompson, the butler, had been released without charge, though he had vanished from the county overnight, presumably taking his silence and his secrets to a place where no one knew the name Arbuthnot. The community was healing, but it was a scarred kind of healing, the sort that leaves a permanent mark on the memory of the land. "I suppose things will go back to normal eventually," Dolly said, though she sounded unconvinced. "We shall have the harvest festival and the Christmas play, and we will talk about the weather and the price of eggs. But I don't think I shall ever be able to trust a best in show ribbon again." "Normal is a very flexible word, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her eyes following the flight of a swallow as it dipped toward the eaves of her cottage. "The village will find new things to whisper about, and new scandals will replace the old ones. But the patterns remain the same. We are all capable of great kindness and great cruelty. The difference is often nothing more than a single small choice made in the dark. I find that the older I get, the more I appreciate the simple things, a garden that behaves itself, a good cup of tea, and the knowledge that the truth, however painful, is always better than a comfortable lie." She picked up her knitting once more, the soft click of the needles the only sound in the quiet garden. The shadows were lengthening, and the first evening star was beginning to twinkle above the church spire. The mystery of the rose and the razor was over, the threads were tied, and the account was settled. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of the earth and the damp grass, content to let the world turn at its own pace. She had seen the darkness and the light, and for now, in the safety of St. Mary Mead, the light was enough.